The year is 476 CE. In Ravenna, the last Roman emperor of the West hands over his crown to a Germanic chieftain. Across the former empire, torch flames flicker in stone halls where new kings sit on wooden thrones, their kingdoms little more than collections of villages bound together by personal loyalty and the sword. What follows is not the collapse of civilization, but its slow, fascinating transformation into something entirely different. Tonight, we journey through 1,000 years of medieval kingdoms, from the ashes of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance. This is a story told not in dates and battles, but in the quiet moments between. A king dying in his sleep while his kingdom fractures around him. A queen ruling from a nunnery. Peasants who never travelled more than 10 miles from their birthplace watching their lords change with the seasons. Take a deep breath. Let time slow down. Forget the rushing world outside and settle into the rhythm of centuries. In the medieval world, change happened not in years but in generations, not in moments, but in the slow turning of seasons. Let your mind wander through these ancient halls and forgotten kingdoms, where power was personal, loyalty was everything, and the future was always uncertain. We begin in the mists of early medieval Europe, where the very concept of a kingdom was being reimagined by men who could barely read, in lands where wolves still howled at the edges of human settlement. The Merovingian kingdoms of Francia emerged from the ruins of Roman Gaul like mushrooms after rain, organic, chaotic, and surprisingly resilient. Clovis I, the first of the great Frankish kings, understood something that the Roman administrators had forgotten, that power in this new world flowed not from laws written in distant capitals, but from the personal bonds between warriors gathered around a mead bench. His kingdom was not a territory in the modern sense, but rather a web of relationships stretching across northern France and western Germany. When Clovis died in 511, his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons according to Frankish custom, not as administrative units, but as personal inheritances, like a farmer dividing his fields among his children. This created the peculiar situation where a single family ruled multiple kingdoms that were sometimes at peace, sometimes at war with each other, and always in a state of fluid negotiation. The palace at Tournai, where Clovis held court, was less a centre of government than a kind of permanent war camp. Here, in wooden halls that smelled of smoke and horses, the king distributed gold armourings to his warriors, settled disputes between nobles, and planned the raids that would bring more wealth and land under his control. The chronicler Gregory of Tours, writing a century later, described these early Frankish courts with a mixture of admiration and horror, admiration for their vitality, horror at their casual violence. But violence in the Merovingian world was not the opposite of order, it was order's primary tool. When King Sigebert of Austrasia was murdered by assassins sent by his brother's wife in 575, the killing was not seen as a breakdown of the system, but as the system working exactly as everyone expected it to. Power belonged to those strong enough to take it and clever enough to keep it. The weak were protected only by the strong, and the strong were restrained only by the possibility of retaliation. This created kingdoms that were simultaneously more personal and more brutal than anything the Romans had known. A Merovingian king knew his warriors by name, knew their fathers and their feuds, knew which of them could be trusted to stand firm in battle and which would flee at the first sign of trouble. But this intimacy came at a cost. When trust broke down, as it inevitably did, the violence was personal too. The most famous of these personal tragedies played out in the court of Chilperic I of Neustria, whose wife Fredegund orchestrated a series of murders that would have impressed the Borgias. Between 575 and 584, she was implicated in the deaths of her husband's previous wife, his son by that wife, his brother, his brother's wife, and numerous court officials who had crossed her. Yet she was also a capable ruler who defended her infant son's claim to the throne against powerful rivals and maintained the kingdom's independence in the face of constant external threats. The paradox of early medieval kingship was everywhere apparent in these Merovingian courts. Kings who could not read supervised the copying of legal codes. Warriors who spent their lives in the saddle patronised monasteries where monks preserved the learning of antiquity. Queens who had been captured in raids became the mothers of future kings and the patrons of great cathedrals. By the end of the 6th century, the Merovingian kingdoms had developed their own distinctive character, neither Roman nor Germanic, but something new. Their laws combined Roman legal principles with Germanic customs of personal honour and collective responsibility. Their art blended classical motifs with the swirling animal-decorated style that the Franks had brought from the forests beyond the Rhine. Their Christianity was orthodox in doctrine but thoroughly Germanic in practice, with warrior saints and miracle-working kings. But perhaps most importantly, they had solved the fundamental problem that had destroyed the Western Roman Empire: how to govern a large territory with limited communications and even more limited resources. The answer was to govern it personally, to make the kingdom an extension of the king's household, and to bind the nobility to the crown not through abstract loyalty to an institution, but through concrete obligations to a man they knew and feared. This system had its obvious limitations. It worked only as long as the king was personally capable, and it tended to fragment when he died. But it also had a crucial advantage. It was flexible. When conditions changed, as they constantly did in the early medieval period, these kingdoms could adapt in ways that more rigid systems could not. The most successful of the Merovingian kings, Dagobert I, who ruled from 629 to 639, demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of this personal form of kingship. He was the last Merovingian to rule a united Francia, and he did so by constant movement, travelling from palace to palace, settling disputes in person, leading armies against the Saxons and the Slavs, and maintaining the complex web of relationships that held his kingdom together. Dagobert's court was a wonder of its age. His palace at Clichy was decorated with silks from Constantinople, his treasury was filled with gold from trade with the Arabs, and his chapel housed relics from all over the Christian world. But for all its splendour, it remained fundamentally a warrior's hall, where the king's power depended on his ability to reward his followers and punish his enemies. When Dagobert died, his kingdom was divided between his infant sons, and power passed to the nobles who served as regents. These were the notorious mayors of the palace, originally household officials who had gradually accumulated power as the kings became more ceremonial. The most famous of these mayors was Charles Martel, who defeated the Arab invasion at Tours in 732 and founded the dynasty that would eventually replace the Merovingians altogether. But before we follow that story, we should pause to consider what the Merovingian kingdoms had achieved. In less than 3 centuries, they had transformed the chaos of post-Roman Gaul into stable, if sometimes violent, political entities. They had created a new form of kingship that combined Germanic traditions of warrior leadership with Christian concepts of divinely ordained authority. And they had established patterns of government: personal rule, decentralized administration, the fusion of military and political power that would shape European civilization for the next 1,000 years. The transition from Merovingian to Carolingian rule was not a sudden break, but a gradual shift of power from one family to another. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, finally deposed the last Merovingian king in 751, but he did so with papal approval and after careful preparation that ensured continuity in government. The new Carolingian dynasty would build on Merovingian foundations, but they would also transform the very nature of medieval kingship. Where the Merovingians had been content to rule their kingdoms as personal possessions, the Carolingians had grander ambitions. They dreamed of recreating the Roman Empire not as a pagan institution, but as a Christian one. This dream would reach its culmination in the reign of Charlemagne, but it would also contain the seeds of its own destruction. The irony of early medieval history is that success often contained the elements of failure. The Merovingians created such effective kingdoms that their own mayors of the palace could take them over. The Carolingians would build an empire so vast that it could not be governed by the personal methods that had made it possible, and the kings who came after them would struggle with the legacy of both, trying to maintain the personal bonds that gave medieval kingship its strength, while governing territories too large for any one man to know personally. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Carolingian story begins not in the great palaces of Aachen or Ravenna, but in the more modest halls of Austrasia, where a family of ambitious nobles was slowly accumulating the power that would eventually make them the masters of Europe. The rise of the Carolingians was a masterpiece of patient ambition played out over 4 generations. It began with Pepin of Landen, who became mayor of the palace in Austrasia around 615. Pepin was not a king, but in many ways he was more powerful than the king he nominally served. He controlled the royal treasure, commanded the royal armies, and made the appointments that determined who held power throughout the kingdom. But Pepin understood that power without legitimacy was fragile. He was careful to present himself not as a usurper, but as the faithful servant of his Merovingian master. He supported the church, patronized monasteries, and maintained the fiction that the king was the real ruler, even as everyone understood that Pepin made the important decisions. This careful balance between reality and appearance became the hallmark of Carolingian statecraft. They were masters of what we might call institutional revolution, changing everything while pretending to change nothing, accumulating power while maintaining the forms that made that power acceptable to their contemporaries. Pepin's grandson, Charles Martel, brought this strategy to its logical conclusion. When he defeated the Arabs at Tours, he did so nominally in the name of his Merovingian king, but everyone understood that the victory belonged to Charles. He used his military success to consolidate his control over Francia, but he did so without taking the royal title. He was content to be the power behind the throne, knowing that real authority mattered more than ceremonial recognition. Charles Martel's reign from 719 to 741 marked a turning point in European history. His victory over the Arabs at Tours has often been described as saving Europe for Christianity, and while this is an exaggeration, it did demonstrate that the Frankish kingdoms had become the dominant military power in Western Europe. More importantly, it showed that effective leadership could unite the fractious Frankish nobility behind a common cause. But Charles Martel's greatest achievement was not military but administrative. He developed a system of land grants that tied the nobility more closely to the central government, while giving them incentives to provide military service. These grants, known as benefices, were not permanent gifts but conditional holdings that could be revoked if the holder failed in his obligations. This system solved one of the fundamental problems of early medieval government: how to maintain a military force without the tax revenues that had supported Roman armies. Instead of paying soldiers with money that the kingdom did not have, Charles Martel paid them with land grants that cost the government nothing but gave the recipients a stake in the system's success. The benefice system would eventually evolve into feudalism, but in Charles Martel's time it was simply a practical solution to an immediate problem. It worked because it aligned the interests of the nobility with those of the central government, and because it was flexible enough to adapt to local conditions throughout the kingdom. When Charles Martel died in 741, his power passed to his sons Pepin the Short and Carloman. The brothers initially continued their father's policy of ruling through figurehead Merovingian kings, but by the 740s this fiction had become untenable. The last Merovingian kings were pathetic figures who had no real power and commanded no real respect. The time had come for the Carolingians to claim the crown they had already earned through their deeds. The transition was handled with characteristic Carolingian subtlety. In 750, Pepin sent ambassadors to Pope Zachary, asking whether it was right that the man who held the real power should be called king. The Pope, who had his own reasons for supporting the Carolingians, replied that it was better for the man who had the power to have the title as well. This papal approval was crucial because it provided religious legitimacy for what was essentially a coup. When Pepin was crowned king in 751, he was not just taking power, he was accepting a divine mandate to rule. This fusion of political and religious authority would become one of the defining characteristics of medieval kingship. But the most dramatic expression of this new vision of kingship would come with Pepin's son, Charles, who would be known to history as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Under his rule, the Carolingian kingdoms would be transformed into something unprecedented since the fall of Rome, a European empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the Pyrenees to the North Sea. Charlemagne's reign, from 768 to 814, was the high point of early medieval civilization. But it was also, in many ways, an impossible achievement, a personal empire held together by the energy and charisma of one extraordinary man, governing territories that were too diverse, too distant, and too large for the administrative methods of the age. The story of Charlemagne's empire is the story of medieval Europe's greatest success and greatest failure. It succeeded in creating, however briefly, a unified Christian Europe that could defend itself against external enemies and maintain internal peace. but it failed to create institutions that could survive its founder's death, and its collapse led to centuries of fragmentation and warfare that would define the later medieval period. Yet even in failure, Charlemagne's empire established patterns and precedents that would shape European civilization for centuries to come. The idea of a Christian emperor ruling over a united Europe would inspire everyone from Otto the Great to Napoleon. The administrative methods developed by Carolingian bureaucrats would be refined and adapted by later kingdoms. And the cultural renaissance that flourished in Charlemagne's court would preserve and transmit the learning of antiquity to future generations. The palace school at Aachen, where Charlemagne gathered the greatest scholars of his age, was more than just a centre of learning. It was a conscious attempt to recreate the intellectual glory of ancient Rome in a Christian context. Here, Irish monks worked alongside Italian clerics and Visigothic refugees to copy classical texts, develop new forms of script, and create the educational curriculum that would be used in European schools for centuries. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Charlemagne's court was its international character. The emperor's closest advisor was Alcuin of York, an English monk who had been educated in the tradition of the Venerable Bede. His biographer was Einhard, a Frankish noble who had been trained in the liberal arts. His architects were probably Italians, his goldsmiths were certainly Byzantines, and his court poets included natives of Ireland, Spain, and Francia. This cosmopolitan culture reflected Charlemagne's understanding of his empire as the successor to Rome, not just politically, but culturally. He saw himself as the heir of Constantine and Augustus, and he wanted his court to rival Constantinople in learning and sophistication. To some extent, he succeeded. The manuscripts produced in Carolingian scriptoriums are among the most beautiful ever created, and the scholarly works produced by Carolingian writers preserved crucial elements of classical learning that might otherwise have been lost. But there was also something distinctly medieval about Charlemagne's empire. Unlike the Roman Empire, which had been held together by law and administration, the Carolingian Empire was held together by personal relationships and Christian faith. Charlemagne ruled not as an abstract sovereign, but as a paternal figure who knew his nobles personally and expected them to know him. This personal style of government had obvious advantages. It created strong bonds of loyalty between the emperor and his followers, and it allowed for flexible responses to local conditions. But it also had serious limitations. It worked only as long as the emperor was personally capable, and it could not easily be transferred to successors who lacked the founder's charisma and ability. Charlemagne understood these limitations, and he tried to address them by creating more systematic forms of administration. He developed a network of royal officials called missi dominici, messengers of the Lord, who travelled throughout the empire carrying out the emperor's orders and reporting back on local conditions. He issued capitularies, legislative decrees, that attempted to standardize legal and administrative procedures across his diverse territories, and he created a palace bureaucracy that could handle the day-to-day business of government even when the emperor was away on campaign. These innovations were impressive for their time, but they were not sufficient to hold together an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The fundamental problem was one of scale. Medieval communications and transportation were simply not adequate to govern such a vast territory effectively. Messages took weeks to travel from Aachen to the frontier, and armies took months to respond to threats in distant provinces. Moreover, the empire's very success created new problems. As Charlemagne's armies pushed deeper into Saxon and Slavic territories, they encountered peoples who had never known Roman rule, and who had little understanding of or sympathy for Carolingian concepts of government. The Saxon Wars, which lasted from 772 to 804, were particularly brutal affairs that required constant military intervention to maintain Carolingian control. The empire's eastern frontier was especially problematic. Here, Charlemagne faced not just hostile tribes, but organised states like the Avar Khaganate, which had dominated the Danube basin for 2 centuries. The destruction of the Avar ring fortresses in 796 was one of Charlemagne's greatest military achievements, but it also created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by the Magyars, a nomadic people whose raids would terrorise Europe for the next century. In the south, Charlemagne's expansion into Italy brought him into conflict with the Byzantine Empire, which still claimed sovereignty over much of the peninsula. The creation of the Papal States and Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 represented a definitive break with Byzantium and the creation of a rival claim to Roman legitimacy. The ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day 800 was heavy with symbolism. Pope Leo III placed the crown on Charlemagne's head while the Roman crowd chanted, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." The message was clear. The Roman Empire had been restored in the West, with Charlemagne as its Christian emperor. But the coronation also created new problems. The Byzantines naturally refused to recognize Charlemagne's imperial title, leading to decades of diplomatic tension and occasional warfare. More importantly, the involvement of the Pope in the coronation established a precedent that would complicate relations between emperors and popes for centuries to come. The question of whether the emperor derived his authority from God directly or through the mediation of the Pope would become one of the central issues of medieval political thought. Charlemagne himself seems to have viewed the coronation as a recognition of power he already possessed, rather than a grant of new authority. But later popes would claim that their role in crowning emperors gave them the right to judge and depose them as well. These constitutional issues might seem abstract, but they had very practical consequences for how the empire was governed. If the emperor was truly God's representative on earth, as Carolingian propaganda claimed, then his authority was absolute within his own domains. But if he ruled by grace of the Pope, then papal approval became necessary for legitimacy, and papal disapproval could justify rebellion. Charlemagne managed to avoid these contradictions through the force of his personality and the success of his policies, but they would plague his successors. The empire he created was too large to be governed personally, too diverse to be administered uniformly, and too dependent on Christian unity to survive religious division. The first signs of strain appeared even before Charlemagne's death. The Saxon revolts of 792 to 793 showed that conquered peoples could not be integrated into the empire by force alone. The conspiracy of Pepin the Hunchback in 792 demonstrated that even the imperial family was not immune to the tensions created by Charlemagne's methods of rule, and the emergence of Viking raids along the North Sea and Atlantic coasts revealed that the empire's defences were not adequate to protect all its territories simultaneously. But perhaps the most serious problem was the question of succession. Charlemagne had originally planned to divide the empire among his 3 sons, following traditional Frankish practice. But when 2 of them died before him, the entire inheritance passed to Louis the Pious, who became emperor in 814. Louis was a capable ruler, but he lacked his father's charisma and military genius. More importantly, he inherited problems that Charlemagne had created but not solved. The empire was still too large to govern effectively, the nobility was still too independent to control easily, and the frontier peoples were still too hostile to ignore safely. Louis's reign, from 814 to 840, marked the beginning of the Carolingian Empire's decline. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion of imperial authority, as local nobles accumulated power at the expense of the central government and external enemies exploited the empire's growing weakness. The most dramatic expression of this decline was the civil war that broke out among Louis's sons in the 830s. The War of the Three Brothers, as it came to be known, was fought not over policy or ideology, but over the division of the imperial inheritance. It pitted brother against brother, destroyed the unity of the Carolingian family, and demonstrated to enemies, both internal and external, that the empire was no longer invincible. The war ended with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided the empire into 3 kingdoms: Francia Occidentalis, roughly modern France, Francia Orientalis, roughly modern Germany, and a middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea to Italy. This division was supposed to be temporary, but it became permanent, marking the beginning of the separate development of France, Germany, and Italy. The Treaty of Verdun is often seen as the death of Charlemagne's empire, but this is not entirely accurate. The empire had already been dying for decades. Verdun simply formalised its demise. The real cause of the empire's collapse was not the treaty, but the impossibility of governing such a vast and diverse territory with the administrative and military tools available to medieval rulers. The paradox of the Carolingian Empire is that it was both the greatest achievement and the greatest failure of early medieval civilization. It succeeded in creating a unified Christian Europe, but it could not create institutions capable of maintaining that unity. It revived classical learning and established new centres of culture, but it could not prevent the fragmentation that would characterise the following centuries. Yet the empire's failure was also, in a sense, its success. The kingdoms that emerged from its collapse, France, Germany and Italy, would become the foundations of modern European civilization. The administrative methods developed by Carolingian bureaucrats would be refined and adapted by later rulers, and the ideal of European unity that Charlemagne represented would continue to inspire political leaders for centuries to come. The end of the Carolingian Empire marked the beginning of what historians call the Feudal Age, a period characterised by political fragmentation, local autonomy, and the dominance of warrior aristocracies. But this was not a return to barbarism, as was once believed, but rather the emergence of new forms of political organisation adapted to the realities of medieval life. The feudal system that developed in the 9th and 10th centuries was not planned or imposed from above, but evolved organically from the conditions created by the Carolingian collapse. As central authority weakened, local nobles assumed responsibility for defence and administration. As royal armies became unreliable, private warriors became essential for security, and as royal justice became distant and ineffective, local courts became the primary means of resolving disputes. This transformation was most dramatic in Francia Occidentalis, which would become the Kingdom of France. Here, the descendants of Charlemagne gradually lost control over the great territorial principalities, Normandy, Anjou, Flanders, Burgundy, that had once been integral parts of the empire. By the end of the 10th century, the Capetian kings who had replaced the last Carolingians controlled little more than the area around Paris, while dukes and counts ruled their territories as independent sovereigns. But this apparent weakness was also a source of strength. The French feudal system that emerged from Carolingian collapse was more flexible and adaptive than the rigid imperial structure it replaced. Local lords who knew their territories intimately were better able to respond to specific threats and opportunities than distant imperial administrators. Regional cultures that had been suppressed under Carolingian uniformity were free to develop their own distinctive characters, and new forms of military organisation based on heavily armoured cavalry proved more effective against Viking and Magyar raiders than traditional Frankish infantry. The emergence of feudalism was not unique to France. Similar developments occurred throughout the former Carolingian Empire, though with significant regional variations. In Germania, the Ottonian kings who succeeded the Carolingians created a new form of empire that combined feudal principles with imperial ambitions. In Italy, the collapse of Carolingian authority led to the emergence of autonomous city-states that would dominate the peninsula for centuries. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation occurred in England, where the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had resisted Charlemagne's expansion were now facing their own existential crisis in the form of Viking invasions. The response to this crisis would produce one of the most remarkable kingdoms of the early medieval period. The story of Anglo-Saxon England in the 9th and 10th centuries is the story of how a fragmented collection of tribal kingdoms was transformed into a unified nation through a combination of military necessity, political genius, and cultural innovation. It begins with the Great Army, a confederation of Viking forces that invaded England in 865 and within a decade had conquered or destroyed most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By 878, only Wessex under Alfred the Great remained as an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Alfred's victory over the Danes at Edington in that year marked the beginning of the English reconquest, but it also marked the emergence of a new form of kingship that would serve as a model for medieval monarchy throughout Europe. Alfred's innovations were practical rather than theoretical. Faced with the need to defend a kingdom under constant threat, he created a system of fortified towns called burhs that could serve as refuges for the civilian population and bases for military operations. Faced with the need to maintain a standing army without the resources of his predecessors, he developed a system of military service based on land tenure that would later be refined into the English feudal system. But Alfred's greatest achievement was cultural rather than military. He understood that a kingdom under siege needed more than just military defence. It needed a sense of identity and purpose that could unite its people in the face of adversity. His programme of educational reform, legal codification, and cultural revival created the intellectual foundations for the English kingdom that his successors would build. Alfred's law code, compiled around 890, was more than just a collection of legal precedents. It was a statement of political philosophy. By combining West Saxon, Mercian and Kentish legal traditions with Christian moral principles, Alfred created a vision of kingship based on justice rather than mere power. His translation of philosophical and historical works from Latin into the vernacular made learning accessible to a broader audience and established English as a language of serious intellectual discourse. These cultural achievements were as important as Alfred's military victories in establishing the foundations for English unity. When his son Edward the Elder and his grandson Athelstan completed the conquest of the Danelaw in the early 10th century, they were not simply imposing West Saxon rule on conquered territories, they were extending a cultural and political system that offered real advantages to those who accepted it. The English kingdom that emerged from these conquests was unlike anything else in contemporary Europe. It was more centralised than the feudal principalities of France, more unified than the tribal duchies of Germany, and more administratively sophisticated than any kingdom since the fall of Rome. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which recorded the kingdom's history in the vernacular, was unprecedented in medieval Europe. The system of shires and hundreds that organised local government was more systematic than anything the Carolingians had achieved, and the royal writs that carried the king's commands throughout the kingdom represented a level of administrative efficiency that would not be matched elsewhere for centuries. But the Anglo-Saxon achievement was also fragile. The kingdom that Alfred had saved and his successors had built was still fundamentally a personal monarchy dependent on the ability and character of its rulers. When weak kings like Ethelred the Unready faced new waves of Viking invasions in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the system's weaknesses became apparent. The Danish conquest of England under Nut in 1016 seemed to represent the failure of the Anglo-Saxon experiment, but in fact it demonstrated its success. Nut chose to rule England through Anglo-Saxon institutions rather than replacing them with Danish ones. He retained the existing system of government, employed Anglo-Saxon administrators, and even adopted English royal ceremonial. The kingdom that Alfred had created was so effective that even its conquerors preferred to use it rather than destroy it. The restoration of Anglo-Saxon rule under Edward the Confessor in 1042 showed that the kingdom's identity had survived foreign conquest. But it also revealed new problems that would ultimately lead to the Norman conquest of 1066. The childless Edward's failure to produce an heir created a succession crisis that provided opportunities for ambitious nobles both within and outside England. The Norman conquest represents one of the great turning points in European history, but its immediate effects were less dramatic than is sometimes supposed. William the Conqueror did not destroy Anglo-Saxon institutions, but adapted them to Norman needs. The result was a hybrid system that combined the administrative efficiency of Anglo-Saxon government with the military effectiveness of Norman feudalism. But the conquest did mark the end of English isolation from continental developments. Under the Norman and Angevin kings who followed William, England became part of a larger political system that stretched across the English Channel and included substantial territories in France. This created new opportunities for cultural and economic exchange, but it also created new sources of conflict that would dominate English politics for centuries. The rise and fall of the Angevin Empire under Henry II and his sons demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval monarchy at its most ambitious. Henry II's territories stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. But this empire, like Charlemagne's before it, proved impossible to govern effectively with the administrative tools available to medieval rulers. The problems that destroyed the Angevin Empire were similar to those that had brought down the Carolingians. The impossibility of maintaining personal control over vast territories, the tendency of local nobles to assert their independence when central authority was weak, and the constant need to choose between conflicting demands from different parts of the empire. But the Angevin collapse also revealed new sources of strength in medieval monarchy. The institutional innovations of Henry II, the development of common law, the creation of royal courts, the establishment of systematic financial administration, proved more durable than his territorial conquests. When King John lost Normandy to Philip Augustus of France in 1204, the English monarchy survived because it had developed institutions that could function independently of royal personality. The early 13th century marked a crucial turning point in the development of European monarchy. The old personal forms of kingship that had characterised the early medieval period were giving way to more institutional systems based on written law, professional administration, and defined procedures. This transformation was most advanced in England and France, but similar developments were occurring throughout Europe. The Magna Carta of 1215, though often misunderstood as an early charter of democracy, actually represents the maturation of medieval feudalism. It was an agreement between the king and his barons that defined their mutual rights and obligations in legally binding terms. The principle that even the king was subject to law would have profound implications for the development of European political thought, but its immediate purpose was simply to regulate the relationship between lord and vassals within the existing feudal system. Similar developments were occurring in France under Philip Augustus and his successors. The Capetian monarchy, that had seemed so weak in comparison to the Angevin Empire, proved to have hidden strengths. While the Angevins were struggling to hold together their far-flung territories, the Capetians were quietly building up their power base in the Île-de-France and establishing the administrative institutions that would enable their successors to create the most powerful monarchy in Europe. The reign of Louis IX, Saint Louis, from 1226 to 1270, marked the high point of medieval French monarchy. Louis combined effective government with personal piety in a way that made him a model for Christian kingship throughout Europe. His legal reforms, his patronage of learning and the arts, and his leadership of the 7th and 8th Crusades established France as the leading power in European civilization. But Louis's achievements also revealed the limitations of even the most successful medieval monarchy. His crusades, though personally inspiring, were military and political failures that drained the kingdom's resources without achieving their objectives. His legal reforms, though admirable in principle, were difficult to implement consistently across the diverse territories that made up the French kingdom. And his personal sanctity, while earning him canonization, was not easily transferable to his successors. The contrast between medieval and modern kingship becomes particularly apparent when we consider the resources available to medieval rulers. Even the most powerful medieval king controlled only a fraction of his kingdom's economic output. Royal revenues came primarily from the king's personal estates, feudal dues, and occasional taxes that required the consent of those who paid them. Standing armies were impossible to maintain, professional bureaucracies were small and inefficient, and royal justice was limited to cases that directly concerned the crown. These limitations meant that medieval kings had to be politicians in ways that modern executives do not. They had to persuade rather than command, negotiate rather than dictate, and maintain personal relationships with potentially rebellious nobles who might at any time decide to assert their independence. The successful medieval king was not necessarily the one with the most resources, but the one who could use limited resources most effectively. This political reality shaped not only how medieval kingdoms were governed, but what they were expected to achieve. Medieval kings were not expected to provide education, healthcare, or social services to their subjects. They were not expected to maintain detailed records of their subjects' activities, or to regulate economic transactions in any systematic way. They were expected to maintain peace within their territories, defend against external enemies, and provide justice to those who appealed to royal courts. Within these limited spheres, the best medieval kings achieved remarkable things. They created legal systems that balanced royal authority with local customs, military systems that could defend large territories with limited resources, and cultural institutions that preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of antiquity. But they did so within constraints that would be unimaginable to modern rulers. The Holy Roman Empire provides perhaps the most dramatic example of both the achievements and the limitations of medieval monarchy. The empire that Otto I restored in 962 was consciously modelled on Charlemagne's creation, but it faced even greater challenges than its Carolingian predecessor. The German territories that formed its core were more diverse and politically fragmented than Francia had been in Charlemagne's time. The Italian lands that provided much of its prestige were difficult to control from north of the Alps, and the imperial title itself created expectations that were impossible to fulfill with the resources available to medieval rulers. The Ottonian dynasty that ruled the empire from 936 to 1002 developed innovative solutions to these problems. They created a system of government based on the German Church, using bishops and abbots as royal administrators in territories where secular nobles might prove unreliable. This Ottonian system was ingenious in its way. Churchmen could not pass their positions to their sons, making them more dependent on royal favour than hereditary nobles. They were also, in theory at least, bound by Christian principles that emphasised obedience to legitimate authority. But the system also created new problems. It made the empire dependent on the cooperation of the church, which had its own interests and agenda. It required constant royal intervention in ecclesiastical affairs, leading to conflicts with the papacy that would dominate imperial politics for centuries, and it worked only as long as the church remained unified in its support for imperial authority. Otto I, the founder of the revived empire, understood these limitations but believed the advantages outweighed the risks. His victory over the Magyars at the Lechfeld in 955 had established him as the protector of Christian Europe, and his intervention in Italian affairs had given him control over the papal election. When Pope John XII crowned him emperor in 962, it seemed that the problems that had destroyed Charlemagne's empire had been solved. But Otto's successors would discover that the imperial title created as many problems as it solved. The need to maintain control over Italy drew German rulers away from their power base north of the Alps, leaving them vulnerable to rebellions at home. The claim to universal authority implicit in the imperial title brought them into conflict not only with the Byzantine Empire, but with emerging national monarchies in France and England, and the involvement with the papacy that had initially strengthened their position would eventually become a source of weakness. The investiture controversy that erupted in the 11th century between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII was not merely a dispute over clerical appointments, but a fundamental conflict over the nature of political authority in medieval Europe. Gregory's claim that the Pope had the right to depose emperors challenged not only the Ottonian system, but the entire tradition of divinely ordained kingship that had developed since the time of Constantine. The dramatic confrontation at Canossa in 1077, where Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow seeking papal absolution, became a symbol of the papacy's triumph over secular authority. But the reality was more complex. Henry's humiliation was tactical rather than strategic. By performing public penance, he regained the support of German nobles who had been looking for an excuse to rebel against him. The civil war that followed showed that neither emperor nor pope could claim absolute authority over medieval society. The compromise that eventually ended the investiture controversy, the Concordat of Worms in 1122, established principles that would govern church-state relations for the rest of the medieval period, but it also marked the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire's decline as an effective political institution. Future emperors would find themselves caught between the demands of their German kingdom and their Italian territories, unable to satisfy either without alienating the other. The reign of Frederick Barbarossa from 1155 to 1190 marked the last serious attempt to make the Holy Roman Empire a reality rather than merely a title. Frederick's efforts to assert imperial authority in northern Italy led to a series of wars that consumed enormous resources and ultimately ended in failure. The Lombard League, an alliance of Italian city-states supported by the Pope, proved that even the most capable medieval ruler could not impose his will on subjects who were determined to resist. Frederick's death on the Third Crusade in 1190 symbolised the end of the imperial dream. His son Henry VI managed to add Sicily to the imperial territories through marriage, but this only made the empire's problems worse by adding another distant and difficult-to-govern territory to an already unwieldy collection. When Henry died unexpectedly in 1197, the empire entered a period of civil war and fragmentation from which it would never fully recover. The emergence of powerful nation-states in France and England during the 12th and 13th centuries posed new challenges to the imperial ideal. These kingdoms were smaller than the Holy Roman Empire, but also more cohesive and easier to govern. They could respond more quickly to threats, administer their territories more efficiently, and develop more sophisticated financial and legal systems than the unwieldy imperial structure allowed. The contrast was particularly stark between the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France under Philip Augustus and his successors. While the empire was fragmenting into competing principalities, France was consolidating under increasingly powerful monarchs who combined feudal lordship with sophisticated administrative methods. The Capetian monarchy developed new forms of taxation, new systems of justice, and new methods of territorial administration that made it far more effective than its theoretical imperial rival. But the French achievement was built on foundations that were themselves precarious. The monarchy's power depended on its ability to maintain the loyalty of great territorial princes who retained significant independent authority. The financial resources that supported royal administration came largely from the prosperous towns and cities of northern France, which could be disrupted by war or economic crisis, and the legal and administrative innovations that made Capetian government so effective required a level of literacy and technical skill that was still relatively rare in medieval society. The reign of Louis IX demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval monarchy at its most successful. Louis's personal piety, combined with effective government, created a model of Christian kingship that was admired throughout Europe. His legal reforms established principles of royal justice that would influence European law for centuries. His patronage of learning and the arts made Paris the intellectual capital of Europe, and his leadership of the 7th and 8th Crusades maintained France's position as the leading power in Christendom. But Louis's Crusades also revealed the growing disconnect between medieval ideals and medieval realities. The age of the great crusading victories was over. Muslim powers in the eastern Mediterranean had learned to counter European military tactics, and the Crusader states were increasingly dependent on Italian naval power and Mongol diplomatic support. Louis's death in Tunis in 1270 during his Second Crusade marked the end of the crusading movement as an effective expression of European power. More significantly, the resources consumed by Louis's crusades highlighted the fundamental weakness of medieval monarchy, its inability to mobilize the full economic potential of its territories. Even the wealthiest medieval kingdom operated on a financial shoestring compared to the Islamic or Byzantine empires it faced in the east. The revenues available to Louis IX were probably less than those controlled by a single Muslim merchant family in Cairo or Damascus. This economic weakness was not simply a matter of primitive technology or administrative incompetence. It reflected the fundamental structure of medieval society, which was based on subsistence agriculture and local exchange rather than long-distance commerce and monetary transactions. The vast majority of medieval people lived in small rural communities that produced most of what they consumed and participated only marginally in broader economic networks. The growth of towns and cities in the 11th and 12th centuries had begun to change this pattern, but slowly and unevenly. Urban populations remained a small fraction of the total. Urban economies were vulnerable to disruption by war or climate change, and urban merchants lacked the capital resources to compete effectively with their Islamic or Byzantine counterparts. The medieval economy was growing, but it was growing from a very low base. The political implications of economic weakness were profound. Medieval kings could not maintain standing armies, could not support large bureaucracies, and could not undertake major public works without cooperation from nobles, who controlled most of the kingdom's productive resources. Royal power was always conditional, always dependent on the consent and support of subjects who had their own interests and agenda. This created a political system that was simultaneously more personal and more constrained than modern government. Medieval kings knew their important subjects individually, and dealt with them face-to-face in ways that modern executives cannot imagine. But they also had to negotiate with these subjects as equals in ways that modern executives would find impossible. The English Parliament that emerged in the 13th century exemplified both aspects of medieval political practice. It was a personal assembly, where the king met with his great subjects to discuss matters of common concern. But it was also an institutional constraint on royal power, that could refuse to grant taxes or approve legislation that its members opposed. The principle that the king could not tax his subjects without their consent, established in England earlier than elsewhere, would have profound implications for the development of European political thought. Similar assemblies emerged throughout Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries: the French Estates General, the German Diet, the Spanish Cortes, the Hungarian Diet. Each reflected local conditions and traditions, but all served similar functions. They provided forums for negotiation between kings and their subjects, mechanisms for resolving disputes without resort to violence, and institutions that could maintain continuity of government during royal minorities or interregnums. The emergence of these representative institutions marked a crucial stage in the evolution of medieval monarchy. Kings were no longer simply war leaders or feudal lords, but had become constitutional rulers whose authority was limited by law and custom. This transformation was gradual and often contested, but by the end of the 13th century it was irreversible in most of Europe. The 100 Years' War between England and France from 1337 to 1453 provides a fascinating case study of how these new forms of monarchy functioned under extreme stress. The war began as a feudal dispute over the succession to the French throne, but it evolved into something much more complex. a struggle between competing visions of monarchy, different concepts of national identity, and alternative approaches to military organisation. The English victories at Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt demonstrated the effectiveness of new military technologies and tactics, but they also revealed the limitations of medieval warfare. English armies could win spectacular battles, but they lacked the resources to occupy and hold large territories against sustained resistance. The initial English successes in the 14th century were reversed in the 15th century, not because of any single decisive defeat, but because of the gradual exhaustion of English resources and the resurgence of French royal authority. The war's most significant outcome was not territorial, but institutional. The financial demands of prolonged warfare forced both kingdoms to develop new forms of taxation, new methods of military recruitment, and new systems of government finance. The English Parliament gained unprecedented power over royal finances, while the French monarchy developed new forms of direct taxation that bypassed traditional feudal obligations. But the war also revealed the growing importance of national identity in European politics. The English and French monarchies that emerged from the conflict were not simply more efficient versions of their 13th century predecessors. They were also more closely identified with specific peoples, territories and cultures. The idea that a king's legitimacy depended not only on his personal qualities or legal rights, but also on his embodiment of national characteristics was beginning to take shape. Joan of Arc's intervention in the French phase of the war exemplified this new understanding of monarchy. Her claim that Charles VII was the rightful king of France was based not on feudal law or papal recognition, but on divine revelation communicated through a peasant girl who embodied the spirit of the French people. The fact that this claim was taken seriously by sophisticated nobles and churchmen shows how medieval concepts of political authority were evolving. The emergence of Burgundy as a major power during the 100 Years' War illustrates another crucial development: the rise of territorial principalities that combined the resources of multiple traditional kingdoms, or duchies, under single rulers. The Burgundian state created by Philip the Bold and his successors controlled territories stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, including some of the wealthiest cities and most productive agricultural regions in Europe. The Burgundian achievement was remarkable because it was accomplished not through conquest, but through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and careful diplomacy. The Dukes of Burgundy understood that medieval politics was fundamentally about personal relationships, and they excelled at creating and maintaining the complex web of alliances, obligations, and loyalties that held their disparate territories together. But the Burgundian state also demonstrated the fragility of personal monarchy. When Charles the Bold was killed at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, his territories were immediately divided among his enemies. The Duchy of Burgundy proper was absorbed by France, while the Low Countries passed to the Habsburgs through Charles's daughter Mary. The Burgundian experiment in territorial consolidation had lasted less than a century, but it provided a model that would be imitated by ambitious rulers throughout Europe. The late medieval period saw the emergence of several such composite monarchies, political entities that combined multiple kingdoms, duchies, or principalities under single rulers while maintaining their separate identities and institutions. The Habsburg dominions, which by the 16th century included Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and much of Germany, represented the most successful example of this type of political organisation. But even the Habsburgs discovered that governing such diverse territories required skills and resources that no single ruler could possess. Charles V's abdication in 1556 and the division of the Habsburg lands between Spanish and Austrian branches reflected not personal failure, but the impossibility of governing effectively across such vast and diverse territories with 16th century administrative methods. The problems that confronted composite monarchies were similar to those that had destroyed earlier attempts at European unification: the difficulty of maintaining personal control over distant territories, the tendency of local elites to assert their autonomy when central authority was weak, and the constant need to balance competing demands from different parts of the realm. But the late medieval period also saw important innovations in the art of government that would eventually make more effective centralization possible. The development of written bureaucracies, standardized legal procedures, and systematic financial administration provided rulers with new tools for controlling their territories. The growth of universities and the spread of literacy created larger pools of trained administrators who could staff royal bureaucracies, and the emergence of printing made it possible to disseminate laws, regulations, and propaganda more widely and consistently than ever before. These innovations were most advanced in Italy, where the city-states of the Renaissance pioneered new forms of diplomatic, financial, and administrative practice. Venice developed the most sophisticated commercial and financial system in Europe, while Florence created new forms of republican government that balanced popular participation with effective administration. The Papal States, despite their spiritual focus, became laboratories for administrative innovation under popes who combined religious authority with temporal power. But Italian political fragmentation also revealed the limitations of city-state government. The Italian wars of the late 15th and early 16th centuries showed that even the most sophisticated city-states could not compete militarily with the emerging nation-states of France and Spain. The wealth and cultural achievements of Renaissance Italy could not compensate for its political division and military weakness. The contrast between Italian fragmentation and the emerging national monarchies of Western Europe highlights one of the central themes of later medieval history: the tension between local autonomy and central authority. Medieval society had always been characterized by multiple overlapping sources of authority: feudal lords, urban corporations, ecclesiastical institutions, royal governments. The later medieval period saw increasing efforts to rationalize and consolidate these competing authorities, but the process was slow, uneven, and often violently contested. In Spain, the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 created a new kind of monarchy that combined the resources of two kingdoms while maintaining their separate institutions and identities. The conquest of Granada in 1492 and the discovery of the Americas in the same year gave the Spanish monarchy resources and opportunities that transformed it into a European and eventually a world power. But the Spanish achievement also depended on factors that were beyond royal control: the accident of Columbus's voyage, the vulnerability of Native American societies to European diseases, and the discovery of silver deposits in Mexico and Peru. The wealth that flowed to Spain from the Americas was crucial to Habsburg power in Europe, but it also created new forms of dependence and vulnerability. The influx of American silver disrupted European monetary systems, contributing to the price revolution of the 16th century that destabilized traditional economic relationships. The need to defend American territories and trade routes forced Spain to maintain military commitments across the globe that eventually exceeded even its enhanced resources. And the dependence on American wealth made Spanish power vulnerable to disruptions in Atlantic commerce that were beyond Spanish control. The expansion of European influence into the Atlantic world in the late 15th and early 16th centuries marked the beginning of the end of the medieval period, but it also represented the culmination of trends that had been developing throughout the medieval centuries. The technology that made oceanic exploration possible, improved ship design, better navigation instruments, more accurate maps, was the result of gradual accumulation of knowledge and technique over many generations. The economic institutions that financed these expeditions, banking houses, commercial partnerships, insurance systems, had developed in the Italian city-states and Flemish towns of the later medieval period. The political structures that organized these enterprises, national monarchies with enhanced administrative capabilities, were the products of centuries of institutional development and experimentation. But the most important medieval contribution to European expansion was probably intellectual: the development of a worldview that saw exploration, conquest, and conversion as not only permissible but divinely ordained activities. The crusading ideology that had motivated medieval expeditions to the Holy Land was easily transferred to new frontiers in Africa, Asia, and America. This ideological continuity helps explain why the transition from medieval to early modern Europe was less abrupt than is sometimes supposed. The Spanish conquistadors who destroyed the Aztec and Inca empires were in many ways medieval knights pursuing traditional goals of glory, wealth, and religious advancement in new circumstances. The missionaries who followed them were continuing a tradition of conversion and cultural transformation that stretched back to the earliest days of medieval Christendom. The persistence of medieval patterns in early modern Europe was not simply a matter of cultural inertia. Many medieval institutions and practices had proven their effectiveness over centuries of experience and were well adapted to the conditions that continued to prevail in much of Europe. The feudal relationships that modern historians often dismiss as archaic remained vital elements of European political life well into the 18th century because they provided flexible frameworks for organising complex societies with limited administrative resources. The medieval church, despite the challenges of the Protestant Reformation, remained one of the most effective international organisations in early modern Europe. Its educational institutions, charitable activities, and cultural patronage continued to play crucial roles in European civilization. Its diplomatic networks facilitated communication between rulers who might otherwise have found it difficult to negotiate, and its spiritual authority provided legitimacy for political arrangements that might otherwise have seemed arbitrary or oppressive. Even the supposedly modern phenomena of nationalism and state sovereignty had deep medieval roots. The idea that political authority should be based on cultural and linguistic unity, rather than purely personal or feudal relationships, had emerged in medieval conflicts like the 100 Years' War. The principle that rulers should exercise exclusive authority within their territories, rather than sharing power with competing institutions, had developed through centuries of struggle between kings, nobles, and churchmen. The medieval contribution to European civilization was not simply a matter of preserving classical learning through the so-called Dark Ages, though this was certainly important. Medieval thinkers, artists, and institutions had created genuinely new forms of culture that would continue to influence European development long after the medieval period had ended. The Gothic cathedrals that dominated medieval cities were not simply larger versions of Roman basilicas, but entirely new architectural forms that expressed distinctively medieval concepts of space, light, and divine presence. The scholastic philosophy developed in medieval universities was not simply a footnote to classical thought, but a sophisticated intellectual system that would influence European philosophy through the early modern period. The Romantic literature that emerged in medieval courts created new forms of literary expression that would shape European culture for centuries. But perhaps the most important medieval innovation was the development of representative institutions that provided alternatives to both autocratic rule and popular democracy. The medieval parliament, diet, or estates general created frameworks for political participation that were more inclusive than classical forms of citizenship but more stable than direct democracy. These institutions would prove crucial to the development of modern constitutional government. The medieval period was also characterized by remarkable religious creativity. The monastic movement that began with the Desert Fathers and reached its culmination in the Cistercian and Franciscan reforms created new forms of spiritual life that combined contemplation with practical activity. The medieval synthesis of classical philosophy and Christian theology produced intellectual frameworks that would influence European thought for centuries, and the medieval development of canon law provided models for legal systems that balanced divine authority with human reason. The economic innovations of the medieval period were equally significant. The agricultural revolution of the 11th and 12th centuries, based on new ploughing techniques, crop rotation systems, and the exploitation of marginal lands, supported population growth and urbanization that would continue through the early modern period. The commercial revolution that began in the Italian city-states created financial instruments and business practices that would become the foundations of modern capitalism. The medieval guild system, often dismissed as restrictive and backward-looking, actually represented sophisticated attempts to balance economic efficiency with social stability. Medieval guilds provided training for skilled workers, quality control for consumers, and social support for their members in ways that purely market-based systems could not match. The decline of the guild system in the early modern period created new opportunities for economic growth, but it also eliminated institutions that had provided security and identity for millions of European workers. The political legacy of the medieval period was similarly complex. Medieval monarchy at its best provided effective government that was both personal and accountable, combining strong executive authority with meaningful consultation and consent. The medieval balance between central authority and local autonomy created political systems that were more flexible and responsive than either pure centralization or complete decentralization would have allowed. But medieval political systems also had serious limitations. They depended heavily on the personal qualities of rulers, making them vulnerable to incompetent or corrupt leadership. They provided little protection for unpopular minorities or individuals who challenged established authority. And they often perpetuated social inequalities that were based more on birth and tradition than on merit or achievement. The transformation of these medieval political systems into early modern absolute monarchies represented both gains and losses. The enhanced authority of Renaissance kings made possible more efficient administration, more effective military organisation, and more coherent policy implementation. But it also eliminated many of the checks and balances that had restrained medieval rulers and made political systems less responsive to the needs and interests of ordinary people. The religious changes of the early modern period followed similar patterns. The Protestant Reformation created opportunities for spiritual renewal and intellectual freedom that had been constrained by medieval church authority. But it also destroyed the cultural unity that had been one of medieval Christendom's greatest achievements and led to religious wars that were far more destructive than most medieval conflicts. The economic transformations of the early modern period were equally ambiguous. The expansion of trade and the development of global markets created new opportunities for wealth and prosperity that were undreamed of in medieval times. But they also created new forms of exploitation and inequality that were in some ways more systematic and impersonal than medieval forms of social hierarchy. As we reach the end of our journey through 1,000 years of medieval kingdoms, it becomes clear that the medieval period was not simply a prelude to modern civilization, but a distinct phase of European development with its own achievements and limitations. Medieval people created political, religious, and cultural institutions that were well adapted to their circumstances and that continued to influence European development long after the conditions that created them had disappeared. The kingdoms we have explored, from the Merovingian realms of early medieval Gaul to the composite monarchies of the later medieval period, were not primitive attempts to recreate Roman imperial government, but genuine innovations in the art of ruling diverse populations with limited resources. The solutions they developed to the fundamental problems of political organisation, how to maintain order, how to distribute resources, how to balance competing interests, remain relevant to political systems throughout the world. The medieval synthesis of Germanic traditions, Roman institutions, and Christian values created a distinctive form of European civilization that was neither classical nor modern, but something entirely its own. This civilization produced remarkable achievements in art, literature, philosophy, and government that continue to enrich human culture. But it also struggled with problems, social inequality, religious intolerance, political instability, that would persist long after the medieval period had ended. The story of medieval kingdoms is ultimately the story of human beings trying to create order and meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic and threatening. Their successes and failures, their innovations and limitations, their hopes and fears remain recognizably human across the centuries that separate us from them. In understanding their achievements, we gain insight not only into the past, but into the enduring challenges of human civilization. The medieval period began with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and ended with the emergence of the modern European state system. But the 1,000 years that separated these endpoints were not simply a transition from one form of political organisation to another. They were a distinct phase of human development that created new possibilities for government, culture, and spiritual life that had not existed before and that continue to influence human civilization today. The daily reality of medieval kingship was far removed from the romantic images that later centuries would create. Consider the court of Louis VII of France in the middle of the 12th century. The king's day began before dawn with prayers in his private chapel, followed by meetings with his closest advisors, the constable who commanded his military forces, the chancellor who managed his correspondence, the seneschal who supervised his household, and the butler who controlled his finances. These were not ceremonial positions, but working roles filled by men who had proven their competence and loyalty through years of service. The morning would typically be spent in judicial sessions, hearing appeals from throughout the kingdom. Medieval kings were expected to provide justice personally, and subjects had the right to petition the crown directly for redress of grievances. Louis would sit in his great hall surrounded by legal advisors and court officials, listening to disputes between nobles, complaints against royal officers, and appeals from townsmen who felt wronged by their local lords. These sessions were not mere formalities. The king's decisions had real consequences for the lives and fortunes of his subjects. The afternoon might bring military matters, reviewing reports from frontier commanders, planning campaigns against rebellious vassals or negotiating with foreign ambassadors. Medieval warfare was not a seasonal activity but a year-round concern. Even in times of nominal peace, border raids, castle sieges and local conflicts required constant royal attention. Louis had to maintain a delicate balance between his various vassals, ensuring that none became powerful enough to challenge royal authority, while preventing conflicts between them from escalating into civil war. Evening brought the social aspects of kingship that were equally important to governance. The royal court was not just a centre of administration, but a cultural institution where nobles from throughout the kingdom gathered to seek favour, arrange marriages for their children, and participate in the elaborate ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchies. The king's evening meal was a public event where seating arrangements, serving protocols and conversation topics all carried political significance. But perhaps most revealing of medieval kingship's personal nature was the constant movement required of successful rulers. Louis VII's itinerary for the year 1147, reconstructed from contemporary chronicles and administrative records, shows him travelling nearly 3,000 miles within his kingdom, visiting over 60 different locations. This was not leisure travel but essential governance. The king had to be seen by his subjects to maintain their loyalty, and he had to inspect his territories personally to ensure that his orders were being implemented. This peripatetic lifestyle created enormous logistical challenges. The royal household numbered several hundred people, including family members, court officials, servants, guards, and hangers-on who hoped to benefit from proximity to power. Moving this entourage from place to place required careful advance planning. Royal agents called harbingers would ride ahead to arrange accommodations, purchase supplies, and ensure that local nobles were prepared to receive the king with appropriate ceremony. The expense of royal travel was staggering by medieval standards. A single royal visit could consume a year's income from a major estate. Local communities were expected to provide hospitality, but this obligation often pushed them to the edge of bankruptcy. The right of hospitality, one of the fundamental prerogatives of medieval kingship, was also one of its most burdensome aspects for subjects. Yet this constant movement was essential to medieval monarchy's effectiveness. In an age before rapid communication, the king's personal presence was often the only way to resolve disputes, ensure compliance with royal commands, and maintain the personal relationships that held the kingdom together. A king who remained in his capital was quickly forgotten by distant subjects and eventually ignored by ambitious nobles. The financial realities of medieval kingship were equally demanding. Royal revenues came from a bewildering variety of sources, each with its own legal basis and collection procedures. The king's domain lands, his personal estates, provided agricultural products, rents, and labour services. Feudal obligations brought military service, monetary payments, and occasional windfalls when vassals died without heirs or committed serious crimes. Royal rights included tolls from markets and bridges, fees for judicial services, and proceeds from the royal mint. But these revenues were often unpredictable and difficult to collect. Agricultural production varied with weather and local conditions. Feudal obligations were contested by vassals who claimed ancient exemptions or special privileges. Royal rights were limited by charters granted to towns and churches in exchange for political support. And the administrative apparatus needed to collect these revenues was expensive to maintain and vulnerable to corruption. The result was that even powerful medieval kings lived in a state of perpetual financial anxiety. Louis VII's annual income, estimated at around £12,000 of silver, made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. But his expenses, maintaining his court, supporting his military forces, fulfilling his charitable obligations, and funding his participation in the Second Crusade, often exceeded his revenues. Like most medieval rulers, he was frequently forced to borrow money from Italian bankers or Jewish moneylenders, offering royal lands or rights as collateral. The human cost of medieval kingship was enormous. Louis VII aged rapidly under the stress of constant travel, political negotiations and military campaigns. His first marriage, to Eleanor of Aquitaine, failed partly because of the incompatible demands of ruling their combined territories. His later marriages were arranged primarily for political advantage rather than personal compatibility. His children were raised largely by others, because his duties kept him away from home for months at a time. Yet Louis persevered because he understood that kingship was not a privilege but a responsibility. Medieval political theory, influenced by Christian theology and classical philosophy, held that kings were appointed by God to maintain justice and protect their subjects. This was not merely theoretical. Medieval kings who failed in these obligations faced rebellion, deposition, and sometimes death. This sacred nature of kingship provided legitimacy, but it also created expectations that few rulers could fully satisfy. The international dimensions of medieval kingship added another layer of complexity to royal responsibilities. Louis VII ruled not in isolation but as part of a network of European rulers who were connected by marriage, feudal obligations, and shared religious beliefs. His decisions affected not only his own subjects, but the broader balance of power in medieval Europe. The Second Crusade, which Louis led from 1147 to 1149, exemplifies the international pressures that shaped medieval kingship. The Crusade was not simply a French enterprise, but a European-wide effort that involved the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of England, and numerous lesser rulers. Louis's decision to participate was driven partly by religious conviction, but also by political calculation. Failure to join the Crusade would have damaged his reputation among his peers and subjects. The Crusade's disastrous outcome had profound consequences for Louis's reign and for the broader development of medieval Europe. The massive expenses of the expedition strained royal finances for years. The military failures damaged French prestige and encouraged Louis's enemies to challenge his authority. The tensions between European leaders during the Crusade contributed to conflicts that would shape European politics for generations. But perhaps most significantly, the Crusade's failure marked the beginning of the end for the crusading ideal that had motivated European expansion since the 11th century. Future crusades would be smaller, less successful, and increasingly driven by political rather than religious motives. The age of the great crusading kings was ending, and with it one of the most distinctive aspects of medieval European civilization. The administrative revolution that transformed medieval government during the 12th and 13th centuries can be seen most clearly in the English kingdom under Henry II and his successors. Henry's innovations were driven by practical necessity. His Angevin empire stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, making traditional forms of personal government impossible. He needed administrative systems that could function in his absence, and legal procedures that did not require royal intervention in every case. The solution was to create institutions rather than relying solely on personal relationships. Henry established royal courts with standardized procedures, appointed professional judges who travelled regular circuits, and developed written records that could be consulted when disputes arose. The Pipe Rolls, which recorded royal revenues and expenditures, the Charter Rolls, which preserved copies of royal grants, and the Patent Rolls, which contained royal letters and proclamations, created an institutional memory that survived changes in royal personnel. But the most revolutionary innovation was the development of common law, a unified legal system that applied throughout the kingdom regardless of local customs or feudal relationships. Previous medieval legal systems had been based on personal status. Nobles were judged by their peers according to feudal law, townsmen by urban law courts according to merchant law, and peasants by manorial courts according to local custom. Henry's common law created uniform procedures and penalties that applied to all royal subjects. This legal revolution had profound social and political consequences. It reduced the power of local nobles who could no longer control justice in their territories. It strengthened royal authority by making the king's courts more attractive to litigants than feudal or ecclesiastical alternatives, and it created a new class of professional lawyers and administrators whose loyalties were to the crown rather than to local magnates. The financial innovations that accompanied these legal reforms were equally significant. Henry II's government developed new forms of taxation that were based on systematic assessment of wealth rather than traditional feudal obligations. The Saladin tithe of 1188, imposed to fund the Third Crusade, required all subjects to pay a percentage of their income regardless of their feudal status. This precedent would be expanded by Henry's successors into regular systems of royal taxation that provided more reliable revenues than traditional feudal dues. But these innovations also created new sources of conflict between kings and their subjects. The barons who rebelled against King John in 1215 were protesting not just royal tyranny, but the erosion of traditional feudal relationships that had previously limited royal power. Magna Carta was not a charter of democratic rights. but an attempt to restore the feudal balance between lords and vassals that the administrative revolution had disrupted. The document itself reveals the complexity of medieval political relationships. Its 63 clauses covered everything from the rights of widows to the regulation of fish weirs, from the standardization of weights and measures to the procedures for feudal military service. Many of its provisions seem trivial by modern standards, but they addressed real grievances that had accumulated during decades of administrative innovation. More significantly, Magna Carta established the principle that even kings were subject to law. Clause 39, which stated that no free man could be imprisoned or dispossessed except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, created a legal protection that would influence constitutional development throughout Europe. The Charter's provision for a committee of barons to enforce royal compliance with its terms represented an early attempt to create institutional constraints on royal power. But the immediate effects of Magna Carta were limited. King John repudiated the Charter within months of signing it, and the civil war that followed lasted until his death in 1216. The Charter was reissued by his young son Henry III, but with modifications that reduced its restrictions on royal authority. The document's long-term significance lay not in its immediate political effects, but in its establishment of precedents that would be invoked by later generations seeking to limit governmental power. The development of parliamentary institutions in 13th century England followed similar patterns of practical innovation, driven by immediate needs rather than theoretical principles. The parliaments summoned by Henry III and Edward I were not representative assemblies in the modern sense, but expanded versions of the royal court that included knights and burgesses along with the traditional nobles and clergy. These early parliaments met irregularly and had limited powers. They could not initiate legislation or control royal appointments, and their consent was required only for extraordinary taxation. But they provided forums for communication between the crown and its subjects that had not existed under purely feudal government. They also created mechanisms for resolving political conflicts that did not require resort to civil war. The model parliament summoned by Edward I in 1295 included representatives of all the major groups in medieval society: archbishops and bishops representing the church, earls and barons representing the greater nobility, knights representing the county communities, and burgesses representing the towns. This assembly was not elected in any modern sense. Representatives were chosen by their peers according to local customs that varied widely throughout the kingdom. Yet these parliamentary institutions proved remarkably durable. They survived weak kings and strong ones, civil wars and foreign invasions, religious reformations and political revolutions. Their flexibility allowed them to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity with medieval precedents. The English Parliament that emerged from these medieval origins would eventually become the model for representative government throughout the world. The French monarchy followed a different path toward institutional development, one that emphasized royal authority rather than representative participation. The Capetian kings of the 13th and 14th centuries created administrative systems that were more centralized and efficient than their English counterparts, but also more dependent on royal personality and initiative. Philip Augustus, who reigned from 1180 to 1223, was the first French king to use administrative innovation as a weapon of territorial conquest. His systematic approach to governing conquered territories, based on appointed officials called bailiffs and seneschals rather than feudal relationships, allowed him to integrate new lands into the royal domain more effectively than previous rulers. The ordinances of 1190, issued before Philip's departure on the Third Crusade, reveal the sophistication of early 13th century royal administration. These detailed instructions for governing the kingdom in the king's absence covered everything from military organization to judicial procedures, from financial administration to diplomatic relations. They demonstrate that French monarchy had evolved far beyond the personal leadership that had characterized earlier medieval kingship. Philip's son, Louis VIII, and grandson, Louis IX, continued this process of administrative consolidation. Louis IX's establishments, issued around 1270, attempted to standardize legal procedures throughout the royal domain while respecting local customs in territories controlled by great vassals. His creation of the Parlement of Paris as a permanent royal court staffed by professional judges marked a crucial step toward the centralized legal system that would characterize later French monarchy. But perhaps Louis IX's most significant innovation was his transformation of royal justice from a feudal obligation into a public service. the king's establishment of himself as the supreme judge of all his subjects, regardless of their feudal status, challenged traditional concepts of noble privilege and created new forms of royal authority. The investigation commissions that Louis sent throughout his kingdom to hear complaints against royal officials demonstrated his understanding that effective government required accountability as well as authority. The economic foundations that supported these administrative innovations were equally important to their success. The growth of French towns during the 12th and 13th centuries provided new sources of royal revenue that were not dependent on feudal relationships. Urban communities purchased charters of freedom from their lords, often paying substantial sums to the crown for royal protection against noble interference. The development of royal taxation followed patterns similar to those in England, but with important differences. French kings were more successful in establishing the principle that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures. The crusading taxes imposed by Louis VII and Louis IX, the subsidies granted for wars against the English and the Flemings, and the regular taxation that emerged during the 100 Years' War all expanded royal revenues beyond traditional feudal limits. But French taxation remained less systematic than its English counterpart. The existence of numerous local exemptions, the resistance of privileged groups to new assessments, and the lack of representative institutions that could legitimize royal demands created constant friction between the crown and its subjects. The French monarchy's financial problems, which would eventually contribute to the Revolution of 1789, had their origins in the medieval failure to create sustainable systems of royal taxation. The cultural achievements of medieval French monarchy were perhaps more impressive than its administrative innovations. The court of Louis IX was recognized throughout Europe as a model of Christian kingship that combined effective government with personal sanctity. The king's reputation for justice attracted petitioners from throughout Europe, while his patronage of learning and the arts made Paris the intellectual capital of medieval civilization. The Sainte-Chapelle, built by Louis IX to house the crown of thorns and other relics of Christ's Passion, exemplifies the fusion of political and religious authority that characterized medieval monarchy at its most successful. The chapel was not simply a religious building but a political statement that proclaimed the French king's special relationship with God and his role as protector of Christendom. The Gothic cathedrals that rose throughout France during the 12th and 13th centuries reflected similar combinations of spiritual and temporal ambition. These massive construction projects required enormous resources and sophisticated organizational skills that could only be provided by the alliance between royal government, ecclesiastical institutions, and urban communities that characterized the medieval synthesis. But the cathedral building campaigns also revealed the limitations of medieval economic development. The construction of Notre Dame de Paris, begun under Louis VII and completed under Philip Augustus, took nearly 2 centuries and consumed resources that might otherwise have been used for roads, bridges, hospitals, or schools. The spectacular achievements of medieval architecture were possible only because of the concentration of wealth and labour that left most of the population living at subsistence levels. The social costs of medieval monarchy extended far beyond the financial burdens imposed on royal subjects. The constant warfare that characterized the medieval period, driven partly by royal ambitions for territorial expansion, created widespread suffering that is difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. The chevauchée, destructive raids designed to demonstrate royal power and damage enemy resources, deliberately targeted civilian populations and economic infrastructure. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337 as a dynastic dispute over the French succession, evolved into a devastating conflict that transformed both kingdoms and influenced the development of European civilization for centuries. The war's most significant battles, Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, Agincourt in 1415, are remembered for their military innovations and dramatic reversals of fortune. But the war's deeper importance lay in its demonstration of how medieval political institutions could adapt to unprecedented challenges. Edward III's claim to the French throne was based on legitimate genealogical arguments that reflected the complex matrimonial politics of medieval dynasties. His mother, Isabella of France, was the daughter of Philip IV and the sister of 3 French kings who died without male heirs. Under the inheritance customs that applied to private property, Edward would have had a strong claim to the French succession, but the application of Salic law which excluded women and their descendants from royal inheritance, gave precedence to Philip of Valois, the nearest male relative of the deceased king. This succession dispute was not merely a legal technicality but a fundamental disagreement about the nature of kingship. Edward's claim was based on hereditary right, the principle that royal authority was a form of property that could be inherited like any other possession. Philip's claim was based on dynastic continuity, the principle that royal authority belonged to the royal family as a whole rather than to individual members who might carry it into foreign dynasties through marriage. The war that resulted from this dispute lasted 116 years and involved dozens of campaigns, sieges, and battles that devastated much of northern and western France. But the conflict was not continuous. It was punctuated by truces, peace negotiations, and periods of relative calm that allowed both kingdoms to recover their strength. The Peace of Bretigny in 1360 seemed to end the conflict definitively, with Edward III renouncing his claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty over enlarged English territories in France. But the peace proved temporary because it failed to address the underlying causes of the conflict. The English territories in France were too valuable to be abandoned voluntarily and too difficult to defend permanently. The French monarchy could not accept the loss of such important provinces without compromising its authority throughout the kingdom, and the social changes produced by decades of warfare had created new interests and expectations that could not be satisfied by either peace or war. The military innovations that characterized the war had profound social and political consequences. The English longbow, which proved so devastating at Crécy and Poitiers, was not simply a superior weapon, but a democratic one that could be used effectively by yeoman farmers with minimal training. This challenged the monopoly on military effectiveness that had given the heavily armoured knight his dominant position in medieval society. Similarly, the development of gunpowder artillery, which became increasingly important in the later stages of the war, required new forms of military organisation and financing that only centralised governments could provide. The Siege of Orléans in 1428 to 1429, which marked the turning point of the war in France's favour, was decided not by individual heroism or superior tactics, but by the systematic application of new military technologies. But the war's most significant innovation was probably financial rather than military. The enormous costs of maintaining armies in the field for decades required both kingdoms to develop new forms of taxation and borrowing that transformed their relationships with their subjects. The English Parliament's control over royal finances, established during the constitutional crises of the 13th century, gave it unprecedented power to influence royal policy during the war. The French monarchy, lacking comparable representative institutions, was forced to negotiate separately with different regions and social groups to secure the revenues needed for the war effort. The Estates General, summoned irregularly during the 14th and 15th centuries, never achieved the institutional continuity and political power of the English Parliament. But local estates in provinces like Languedoc and Brittany developed significant autonomy in exchange for their financial contributions to the royal war effort. These financial negotiations had lasting constitutional consequences. The English Parliament's insistence on controlling military expenditures established precedents for legislative oversight of executive action that would influence the development of constitutional government throughout Europe. The French monarchy's reliance on provincial estates created legal and political precedents for regional autonomy that would complicate royal efforts at centralisation for centuries. The war's conclusion in 1453 marked the end of English continental ambitions and the beginning of French national unification under centralised royal government. But the conflict's most important legacy was probably its demonstration that medieval political institutions could adapt to new circumstances while maintaining continuity with traditional forms and procedures. Joan of Arc's intervention in the war exemplified this combination of innovation and tradition. Her claim to divine revelation challenged conventional forms of political and religious authority, but her support for the Dauphin Charles's claim to the throne reinforced traditional concepts of dynastic legitimacy. Her military leadership violated medieval conventions about women's roles in warfare, but her insistence on proper religious observances and respect for clerical authority maintained connections with established religious traditions. The trial and execution of Joan of Arc by her English and Burgundian captors in 1431 revealed the religious and political tensions that characterized late medieval civilization. The charges against her, heresy, witchcraft, and wearing men's clothing, reflected anxiety about social change and religious innovation that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Her rehabilitation by a papal commission in 1456 demonstrated the Catholic Church's ability to adapt its positions to changing political circumstances. But Joan's most significant contribution to the war may have been her role in creating new forms of national identity that transcended traditional feudal loyalties. Her appeal to the French people as a whole, rather than to particular social classes or regional groups, helped establish concepts of national unity that would become increasingly important in later European history. The emergence of Burgundy as a major power during the Hundred Years' War illustrates another important development in late medieval politics: the creation of composite monarchies that united diverse territories under single rulers through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and conquest. The Burgundian state, created by Philip the Bold and his successors, controlled territories stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, including some of the wealthiest cities and most productive agricultural regions in Europe. The Burgundian achievement was remarkable because it was accomplished primarily through diplomacy rather than warfare. Philip the Bold's marriage to Margaret of Flanders in 1369 brought him control of the Low Countries, while his son John the Fearless extended Burgundian influence through his leadership of the Armagnac faction during the French Civil War of the early 15th century. Philip the Good's alliance with the English during the 1420s and 1430s made Burgundy the dominant power in northern France, but the Burgundian state was held together more by personal loyalty than by institutional unity. The Duke of Burgundy ruled his various territories according to their separate laws and customs, maintaining different administrative systems, currencies, and legal procedures in different parts of his domains. This flexibility allowed him to accommodate local interests and traditions, but it also made the state vulnerable to fragmentation when ducal authority was challenged. Charles the Bold's attempts to transform his inheritance into a unified kingdom led to the conflicts with France and the Holy Roman Empire that ultimately destroyed Burgundian independence. His death at the Battle of Nancy in 1477 ended the Burgundian experiment in territorial consolidation, but it also demonstrated the continuing vitality of the feudal principles that Charles had tried to transcend. The partition of the Burgundian inheritance between France and the Habsburgs had profound consequences for European development. France's acquisition of the Duchy of Burgundy proper strengthened the monarchy's position in eastern France and eliminated a major rival to Capetian authority. But the Habsburg acquisition of the Low Countries created a power base that would enable Charles V to dominate European politics during the first half of the 16th century. The Italian Wars that began in 1494 with the French invasion of the Kingdom of Naples marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of early modern European history. But these conflicts also represented the culmination of trends that had been developing throughout the medieval period: the competition between territorial monarchies, the application of new military technologies, and the emergence of balance of power diplomacy. The French claims to Naples and Milan that justified the Italian invasions were based on medieval principles of dynastic inheritance that stretched back to the Angevin conquests of the 13th century. Charles VIII's invasion of Italy in 1494 was presented as the restoration of a legitimate French rights rather than an aggressive war of conquest. But the military methods used to pursue these claims, professional armies, siege artillery, and systematic devastation of enemy territories, represented new forms of warfare that would characterize the early modern period. The League of Cambrai in 1508 and the Holy League of 1511 demonstrated how quickly the medieval system of personal alliances could be replaced by balance of power diplomacy based on raison d'etat rather than feudal obligations or religious solidarity. The constantly shifting alliances that characterized the Italian Wars created a new form of international relations in which temporary advantage took precedence over traditional loyalties. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Italian Wars was their demonstration of how medieval political institutions could be transformed by new economic and technological conditions. The French monarchy's ability to maintain large armies in Italy for decades depended on tax revenues that could only be collected through the administrative systems developed during the medieval period. The Spanish monarchy's ultimate victory in the Italian Wars was made possible by American silver that would not have been available without the technological and organisational innovations of medieval European expansion. As the last medieval kingdoms transformed themselves into early modern states, they carried with them the accumulated wisdom and experience of 1,000 years of political experimentation. The representative institutions, legal principles, and cultural traditions that had developed during the medieval period would provide the foundations for the European expansion that would eventually bring European influence to every corner of the globe. The medieval synthesis of Germanic traditions, Roman institutions, and Christian values had created distinctive forms of European civilization that were neither classical nor modern, but something entirely their own. This civilization had produced remarkable achievements in government, law, philosophy, literature, and the arts that would continue to influence human development long after the medieval period had ended. But medieval civilization had also struggled with fundamental problems that would persist into the modern era. The tension between local autonomy and central authority, the challenge of balancing spiritual and temporal concerns, the difficulty of creating political systems that could accommodate diversity while maintaining unity. These challenges would continue to shape European and world history for centuries to come, ensuring that the medieval period remained not simply a chapter in the past, but a continuing influence on the present and future of human civilization. The transformation of medieval kingdoms into early modern states was not a sudden break with the past, but a gradual evolution of institutions and practices that had been developing for centuries. The monarchies that emerged from this transformation retained many medieval characteristics, while adapting to new conditions and opportunities created by technological innovation, economic expansion, and cultural change. The economic foundations of medieval kingdoms were far more sophisticated than traditional accounts suggest. Consider the revenue systems developed by the Norman kings of England in the decades following the conquest of 1066. The Domesday Book, compiled between 1085 and 1086 under William I, was not merely a census but a comprehensive economic survey that recorded the productive capacity of virtually every estate in England. The document's 413 folios contained detailed information about landholding, population, livestock, mills, fisheries, and salt works that provided the basis for systematic taxation for centuries. The Domesday Survey revealed that England's annual agricultural production was worth approximately £73,000 in silver, making it one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe despite its relatively small size. But this wealth was distributed extremely unevenly. The king and his immediate tenants-in-chief controlled nearly half of all productive land, while the bottom, 90% of the population, owned less than 10%. This concentration of wealth made possible the architectural and cultural achievements of Norman England, but it also created social tensions that would influence English politics for generations. The administrative systems that managed this wealth were equally sophisticated. The Exchequer, established under Henry I in the early 12th century, was perhaps the most advanced financial institution in medieval Europe. Its procedures, recorded in the Dialogue of the Exchequer written by Richard Fitz-Neal around 1179, combined Roman accounting principles with Germanic legal traditions to create a system of financial oversight that was both comprehensive and resistant to corruption. The Exchequer's annual audit sessions, held at Westminster each Easter and Michaelmas, brought together royal officials from throughout England to account for their stewardship of royal revenues. Each sheriff was required to present detailed accounts of his county's finances, supported by physical evidence, bags of coins, wooden tally sticks recording debts, and written records of special transactions. These sessions were not mere bookkeeping exercises but judicial proceedings where financial disputes could be resolved and defaulting officials could be punished. The famous pipe rolls that recorded these proceedings provide an extraordinary window into medieval government in action. The pipe roll for the year 1130, which survives complete, shows royal revenues of £66,000 from a kingdom with a total population of perhaps 2 million people. This represents a level of taxation that was not achieved by most European states until the early modern period. The roll's entries document everything from the king's wine purchases to the wages of castle guards, from judicial fines imposed on rebellious barons to payments for maintaining the royal hunting preserves. But perhaps most interesting are the roll's records of royal expenditure on what we might call public works. Henry I spent over £400 annually on road maintenance, bridge construction, and harbour improvements, investments that supported commercial development and military effectiveness. he spent nearly £1,000 per year on his building projects, including the expansion of royal castles, the construction of new administrative centres, and the patronage of religious institutions. These expenditures were not simply royal luxuries, but systematic investments in the infrastructure that made effective government possible. The success of the Anglo-Norman financial system depended on innovations in monetary policy that were centuries ahead of their time. Henry I's reforms of the English currency, implemented around 1125, established uniform weight and purity standards that made English silver coins acceptable throughout Europe. The periodic recoinage that recalled old coins and issued new ones with updated designs prevented the debasement that plagued other medieval currencies. And the use of silver pennies as the basis for account keeping created a stable medium of exchange that facilitated both local trade and international commerce. These monetary innovations had profound social and political consequences. The availability of reliable currency made it possible for the crown to commute feudal obligations into money payments, reducing the military service owed by tenants-in-chief from the traditional 40 days per year to much shorter periods supplemented by scutage, monetary payments that could be used to hire professional soldiers. This transformation of feudal relationships would eventually undermine the personal bonds that had held medieval society together, but it also made possible more efficient military organisation and more flexible responses to changing strategic circumstances. The German kingdoms that emerged from the breakup of the Carolingian Empire developed very different approaches to economic organisation, ones that reflected the more decentralised political structures that characterised medieval Germany. The Ottonian kings of the 10th and 11th centuries based their power not on systematic taxation, but on the exploitation of crown lands, the profits of royal justice, and the resources of the German Church. The so-called Ottonian system relied heavily on ecclesiastical wealth to support royal government. German bishops and abbots controlled approximately one-third of the kingdom's agricultural land, and they were expected to provide military service, administrative expertise, and financial support to the crown. This arrangement was formalised in the practice of investiture, by which the king appointed ecclesiastical officials and invested them with both spiritual and temporal authority over their territories. The economic foundation of this system was the concept of proprietary churches, religious institutions that were owned and controlled by lay authorities rather than by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Ottonian kings had inherited or conquered extensive church properties throughout Germany, and they used these resources to reward supporters, fund military campaigns, and support the elaborate court ceremonies that maintained royal prestige. But the system also created enormous administrative challenges. German bishops were expected to be both spiritual leaders and secular administrators, roles that required very different skills and often conflicting loyalties. The need to maintain control over scattered ecclesiastical properties required constant royal intervention in church affairs, leading to conflicts with papal authority that would eventually destroy the system's effectiveness. The investiture controversy that erupted in the 11th century between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII was not simply a dispute over religious authority, but a fundamental conflict over the economic foundations of medieval government. Gregory's prohibition on lay investiture threatened to deprive the German monarchy of the ecclesiastical resources that made effective government possible. Henry's resistance to papal demands reflected not just personal pride, but the practical impossibility of governing the Holy Roman Empire without church support. The compromise reached in the Concordat of Worms in 1122 attempted to separate spiritual and temporal authority within ecclesiastical institutions, but it also marked the beginning of the end for the Ottonian system. Future German kings would be forced to rely more heavily on secular nobles whose support was less reliable and more expensive to maintain. The gradual weakening of royal authority in Germany during the 12th and 13th centuries reflected not just political miscalculation, but the erosion of the economic foundations that had made Ottonian government possible. The Italian city-states that emerged during the 11th and 12th centuries developed the most innovative economic systems in medieval Europe, ones that would eventually influence commercial development throughout the continent. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and other maritime republics created new forms of commercial organisation that combined private enterprise with public authority in unprecedented ways. The Venetian system was particularly sophisticated. The city's unique position as an intermediary between Byzantine and Western European markets allowed it to develop specialized financial instruments that facilitated long-distance trade. The colleganza contracts that financed Venetian trading expeditions were early forms of joint stock ventures that distributed risks and profits among multiple investors. The development of banking services, foreign exchange operations, and marine insurance created a commercial infrastructure that was centuries ahead of its time. But Venice's commercial success also depended on political innovations that were equally advanced. The Venetian constitution, which evolved during the 11th and 12th centuries, created a system of government that balanced democratic participation with aristocratic leadership. The Great Council, which included all adult male members of the patrician class, provided broad-based political participation within the ruling elite. The Doge, elected for life but subject to constitutional constraints, provided executive leadership without the dynastic complications that plagued hereditary monarchies. The economic policies pursued by Venetian governments were consistently designed to support commercial expansion rather than territorial conquest. The city's military forces were primarily naval, focused on protecting trade routes and commercial privileges rather than acquiring land. The diplomatic strategies that Venice pursued were based on commercial calculation rather than feudal obligation or religious ideology. And the legal system that governed Venetian commerce was designed to facilitate business transactions rather than enforce social hierarchies. These policies produced remarkable results. By the 13th century, Venice had become the wealthiest city in Europe, with a per capita income that probably exceeded that of any other medieval community. The city's population, which reached nearly 200,000 by 1300, was supported by commercial activities that connected markets from England to the Black Sea. The architectural and artistic achievements that made Venice famous throughout Europe were financed by commercial profits rather than agricultural rents or royal patronage. The Florentine Republic developed a different but equally innovative approach to urban government and economic development. Florence's wealth was based not on long-distance commerce, but on manufacturing, particularly the production of woolen textiles that were exported throughout Europe. The city's guilds, professional associations that regulated manufacturing and trade, evolved into political institutions that exercised governmental authority within their spheres of competence. The Florentine constitution of the 13th and 14th centuries was based on the principle of corporate representation rather than individual citizenship. The 7 major guilds, including the wool merchants, silk merchants, bankers and lawyers, chose the city's governing councils and controlled its major policies. Lesser guilds representing artisans and shopkeepers had more limited political rights, but still participated in urban government, and even workers who were not guild members had access to judicial procedures and legal protections that were unavailable to peasants in rural areas. This system of guild government created economic policies that were designed to protect Florentine manufacturing and commercial interests. The city's wool industry was protected by import restrictions and export subsidies that gave Florentine products competitive advantages in international markets. Banking activities were regulated to prevent excessive risk-taking, while encouraging the accumulation of capital for investment in productive enterprises. And the city's military policies were designed to secure access to raw materials and markets, rather than to pursue territorial expansion for its own sake. The success of Florentine manufacturing depended on technological innovations that were often developed through guild-sponsored research and development. The water-powered mills that processed wool were among the most advanced industrial installations in medieval Europe. The dyeing techniques that gave Florentine textiles their distinctive colours were closely guarded trade secrets that provided competitive advantages for decades. And the banking methods developed by Florentine firms, including double-entry bookkeeping and letters of credit, became standard practices throughout Europe. But perhaps most important was the development of human capital through educational institutions that were designed to support commercial activities. Florence was one of the first European cities to establish schools that taught arithmetic, accounting, and commercial law to the sons of merchants and artisans. The University of Florence, founded in 1321, emphasized practical subjects like medicine and law rather than the theological and philosophical studies that dominated older universities. And the city's libraries and scriptoriums preserved and transmitted commercial knowledge that would not have survived in purely religious institutions. The contrast between these Italian commercial republics and the territorial monarchies of Northern Europe illustrates the diversity of medieval political and economic systems. Where kings like Louis VII of France or Henry II of England governed primarily agricultural societies through feudal relationships, the Italian cities created urban civilizations based on manufacturing and commerce. Where Northern European governments relied on personal loyalty and military service, Italian cities developed impersonal institutions based on legal procedures and economic calculation. But these different systems also influenced each other through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Italian banking houses financed the military campaigns of Northern European kings, while Northern European markets provided outlets for Italian manufactured goods. Italian legal and administrative innovations were adopted and adapted by territorial monarchies, while Italian cities sometimes imitated the ceremonial and military practices of royal courts. The emergence of composite monarchies in the later medieval period represented attempts to combine the advantages of both systems, the resources and military power of territorial kingdoms, with the commercial sophistication and institutional flexibility of urban republics. The Burgundian state, created by Philip the Good in the 15th century, included both agricultural territories like the Duchy of Burgundy proper and commercial cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels. This combination of different economic systems within a single political entity created both opportunities and challenges that would influence European development for centuries. The administrative methods developed to govern such diverse territories were necessarily complex and often contradictory. The Burgundian government maintained separate legal systems for different regions, different currencies for different economic zones, and different military obligations for different social groups. This flexibility allowed local communities to maintain their traditional institutions while contributing to the common defence and general welfare. But it also created opportunities for conflict between different parts of the state that could be exploited by external enemies. The personal nature of Burgundian rule was both a strength and a weakness. The Duke of Burgundy's ability to move freely between his different territories, to understand their particular needs and interests, and to mediate between competing demands made possible a level of political integration that could not have been achieved through purely institutional means. But the system's dependence on ducal personality and initiative made it vulnerable to disruption when the ruler was absent, incapacitated, or incompetent. Charles the Bold's attempts to transform his inherited territories into a unified kingdom reflected his understanding of these problems, but his solutions created new difficulties that proved even more serious. His efforts to standardize legal procedures throughout his territories alienated local elites who had profited from existing arrangements. His military campaigns to acquire additional territories drained resources that might have been used to strengthen internal administration, and his confrontational approach to neighbouring powers created enemies who were eager to exploit any signs of Burgundian weakness. The destruction of the Burgundian state following Charles's death at Nancy in 1477 marked the end of one of medieval Europe's most ambitious experiments in political organisation. But the methods developed by Burgundian administrators, the use of representative assemblies to legitimise taxation, the employment of trained bureaucrats to implement policy, the development of diplomatic procedures to manage international relations, would be adopted and refined by the territorial monarchies that partitioned the Burgundian inheritance. The Spanish monarchy that emerged from the union of Castile and Aragon under the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella represented another approach to composite government, one that would prove more durable than its Burgundian predecessor. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1469 created a personal union between two kingdoms that maintained their separate institutions while coordinating their major policies. This arrangement allowed each kingdom to preserve its traditional laws and customs, while benefiting from the enhanced resources and capabilities that unity provided. The administrative structure that governed this composite monarchy was remarkably sophisticated. The Council of Castile and the Council of Aragon provided separate governmental institutions for each kingdom, while the Council of State coordinated policies that affected both territories. Royal secretaries managed the enormous correspondence that linked the scattered territories of the Spanish monarchy, while royal councils provided specialised expertise in military, financial, and judicial affairs. But perhaps most important was the development of administrative procedures that could function effectively across vast distances and diverse political systems. The Spanish monarchy's territories eventually stretched from the Netherlands to Naples, from Mexico to the Philippines, creating communication and coordination challenges that had no precedent in medieval history. The solutions developed by Spanish administrators, regular reporting systems, standardized procedures for policy implementation, and flexible arrangements for local adaptation would influence governmental development throughout the early modern period. The financial foundations of Spanish power were equally innovative. The traditional revenues of Castile and Aragon, agricultural rents, commercial taxes and judicial fees, were supplemented by new sources of income that reflected the monarchy's expanded territories and responsibilities. The wealth that flowed from the Americas, particularly after the discovery of silver deposits at Potosi in 1545, provided resources that transformed not only Spanish power, but the entire European economy. But this wealth also created new forms of dependence and vulnerability that would ultimately undermine Spanish hegemony. The Spanish monarchy's reliance on American silver made it vulnerable to disruptions in Atlantic commerce that were beyond Spanish control. The inflation that resulted from the massive influx of precious metals disrupted traditional economic relationships throughout Europe, creating social and political tensions that would influence European development for centuries. The military innovations that characterized the early modern period had their origins in medieval experiments with new forms of warfare and military organization. The Spanish tercios that dominated European battlefields during the 16th century were based on infantry formations that had been developed during the Italian wars of the late 15th century. The artillery that made traditional fortifications obsolete had evolved from the siege engines that medieval engineers had perfected during centuries of castle warfare, but perhaps most important was the development of professional military service as an alternative to feudal obligations. The condottieri, who commanded Italian armies during the 14th and 15th centuries, were professional soldiers who sold their services to the highest bidder, rather than feudal vassals who served their lords according to traditional obligations. This commercialization of military service made possible more flexible and effective military organization, but it also created new forms of political instability as mercenary commanders pursued their own interests rather than those of their employers. The Swiss infantry that revolutionized European warfare during the late medieval period exemplified both the possibilities and the limitations of professional military service. Swiss pikemen, organized in disciplined formations and trained in standardized tactics, proved capable of defeating heavily armored knights who had dominated European battlefields for centuries. But Swiss military effectiveness depended on social and political conditions, communal solidarity, economic motivation, and political independence that could not easily be replicated in other societies. The impact of these military innovations extended far beyond the battlefield. The need to recruit, train, equip, and pay professional soldiers required governmental capabilities that exceeded those of traditional medieval monarchies. The development of standing armies created new relationships between rulers and subjects based on taxation and service, rather than feudal obligation and personal loyalty. And the destructive potential of new military technologies made warfare more decisive but also more devastating for civilian populations. The transformation of medieval kingdoms into early modern states was thus not simply a matter of institutional development, but a comprehensive change in the nature of political organization. The personal relationships that had characterized medieval government were supplemented and eventually replaced by impersonal institutions based on legal procedures and administrative expertise. The local autonomy that had been one of medieval society's most distinctive features was gradually subordinated to central authority, exercised through professional bureaucracies. But this transformation was neither sudden nor complete. Many medieval institutions and practices persisted well into the early modern period, because they continued to serve useful functions that newer institutions could not fulfill. The feudal relationships that bound nobles to their monarchs provided frameworks for military service and political loyalty that complemented rather than contradicted more modern forms of organization. The representative assemblies that had emerged during the medieval period continued to play important roles in legitimizing royal policies and mediating between central authority and local interests. The cultural achievements of the medieval period also provided foundations for early modern developments that are often overlooked in accounts that emphasize discontinuity rather than continuity. The universities that had been founded during the medieval period became centers of humanistic learning that contributed to the intellectual developments of the Renaissance. The legal traditions that had evolved during centuries of medieval experience provided frameworks for the more systematic law codes that characterized early modern states. And the artistic and architectural innovations of the medieval period influenced the cultural developments that would make the early modern period one of the most creative in human history. Perhaps most important was the medieval contribution to European concepts of political legitimacy and governmental responsibility. The idea that rulers were accountable to their subjects for the exercise of political authority, which had emerged from centuries of conflict between medieval kings and their nobles, provided the intellectual foundation for the constitutional developments that would eventually limit the power of absolute monarchs. The principle that governmental authority should be exercised according to law rather than arbitrary will, which had been established during medieval struggles over royal prerogatives, would become one of the defining characteristics of modern political systems. The medieval experiment in Christian kingship, with all its contradictions and limitations, thus represents one of humanity's most sustained and sophisticated attempts to create political systems that serve both practical needs and higher purposes. Its legacy continues to influence political thought and practice throughout the world, reminding us that the medieval period was not simply a prelude to modernity, but a distinct and valuable phase of human development that deserves study and respect on its own terms. The story of medieval kingdoms is ultimately the story of human creativity and adaptability in the face of enormous challenges. Medieval people created political, religious, and cultural institutions that were remarkably well suited to their circumstances and that provided models for later development. Their successes and failures, their innovations and limitations, their hopes and fears remain relevant to contemporary efforts to create effective and humane forms of government. In understanding their achievement, we gain insight not only into the historical development of European civilization, but into the enduring challenges of human political organization.